025 hours, May 27th, 2545, military calendar. Ort cloud of the Epsilon Eridani system. Oni prowler, pale horse. The deck plates underneath Marcos's feet rippled like they were made of some kind of ferrofluid. Everything about the Oni prowler felt eerie and hyper-advanced. Their smaller profiles made dropping in and out of slipspace much more noticeable in that it wasn't. Normally, when a ship drops out of slipspace, there is a noticeable, hard reverberation throughout the hull. The ship would creak, groan, and ping under the influence of the change between normal space and the 11 hyperdimensional field known as slipspace. Prowlers were not like that. Their transition was smoother, more fluid. Reality seemed to unfold down the length of the ship as it dropped back into normal dimensions of space-time, and this gave rise to the feeling that the deck plates rippled. Marcos had always been fascinated with physics and was equal parts enthralled and horrified by the knowledge that a single aberration in the ship's quantum-stabilized field as it transitioned to normal space could have the ship, and indeed himself, fold into each other and intersect their physical forms, or indeed quite literally tear himself and the ship apart at the atomic level, and he wouldn't even have realized that he died. His musings on the metaphysics of hyperdimensional travel were interrupted by Lieutenant Wilde's voice over the ship's intercom. Fireteam Ares report to communications. "You heard her," Marcos looked around the quarters. "Make ready." It was a small but well-furnished space with synth mahogany composite wall paneling to give the impression of a lavish space. Marcos was leant against the bulkhead, staring out into the abyss through the small recessed window. There was nothing to see in slipspace, and now they had dropped back into normal space, the ship had been put into its stealth mode, and panels had slid across to cover any exterior windows. This served to avoid light pollution or signals from the ship permeating into space to give away their position, while also allowing the ship's active camouflage systems to engage and hide the ship under a modular cloak of invisibility by bending light around the ship. The view out of the window was now being provided by a holographic projection display that showed just the faint twinkle of distant stars, the brightest being that of Epsilon Eridani, though still very dull due to their immense distance from the star. Hamish and Cairo were packing up playing cards over one of their bunks. Jay was sat in a chair, slumped, almost uncomfortably, and busying himself on a datapad, but showing signs that he was closing whatever it was he was doing and getting ready to move. Marcos couldn't make sense of the situation. They had assaulted a senior officer and been confined to quarters until arrival at Reach, where they'd be handed over to UNSC command, likely to face court-martial and whatever would follow. Yet shortly after arriving on the edge of the system, a prowler, a stealth ship commonly used almost exclusively by the Office of Naval Intelligence, had docked with the UNSC Edinburgh, and an Oni officer had told them that there were interested parties looking to acquire them, and that the issues that Ares had found themselves in had presented Oni with an opportunity. The slipspace jump was only an hour or so in duration, indicating that the distance travelled wasn't immense, but that there was urgency to get there at an allotted time, and it was clear they were on the extreme edge of the Epsilon Eridani system, in the Oort cloud surrounding the system, a collection of icy objects and dust left over from the formation of the system. If he were Oni and had a prison for the worst of the worst, to make people disappear, putting one in an Oort cloud would make a lot of sense. But the manner of their travel and accommodation by the crew of the Pale Horse suggested a prison wasn't their ultimate destination. So what did Oni want with an ODST fireteam? The rest of Ares were now moving towards the door. Marcos shook his head and pressed his armless augmented reality glasses grip surface against his temples. The surface reacted to the pressure of his skin and created a comfortable but secure non-stick adhesion to his skin. The glasses read his brainwaves and loaded up the interface. It received incoming data and displayed a waypoint hovering in his field of view with a faint glowing line traced along the floor, indicating the way to communications. He dismissed the thoughts of Oni's motivations for later recall and followed his team out of the quarters. A quick walk through the narrow corridors of the prowler, and they found themselves at the doors of the communications room. The door slid apart and Lieutenant Wiles fixed Marcos with a whimsical stare. "You're to be debriefed regarding current events." She glanced across the faces of the others of Ares, and then fixed back on Marcos and raised an eyebrow above her emerald eyes. "You have some choices to make," she smiled. The LT stepped aside and Ares, led by Marcos, entered the room. It was a rectangular room with a full-wall display at one end and a table lined on both sides with chairs, including one at the head of the table. Ares moved to take seats. Hamish sat in the chair at the head of the table and was almost instantly shooed out of it by the LT. The wall display winked on, and a man in a naval officer's uniform appeared. He bore the rank insignia of Rear Admiral. "Officer on deck," Marcos immediately called out. Fireteam Ares were halfway through standing up and saluting when the voice of Rear Admiral Aiden Venko interrupted. "At ease." They uneasily sat back down. "Fireteam Ares, you assaulted an officer. In truth, you beat him mercilessly while he was being held in the brig," Venko began. "Up until an hour ago, you were looking at a court-martial for an Article 90, assaulting or disobeying a superior officer. Now we have quite a different situation on our hands." The LT picked up where Venko had left off. "The UNSC acknowledges Captain Roberts' conduct at Actium, and he was going to face punishment for his actions." The LT could see a question on Marcos' lips. "Speak freely, squad leader." Marcos shook his head in puzzlement. "Ma'am, you said was. He was going to face punishment." Marcos didn't need to finish his question before the LT answered. Captain Roberts was transferred to the infirmary on Anchor 7 at Reach under MP custody. His condition deteriorated thereafter. They were unable to revive him. Wiles watched the expressions play across the faces of Fireteam Ares when Rear Admiral Venko continued. "We are now looking at an Article 118. Murder," Marcos replied, looking at the table. Aiden nodded and continued. "Autopsy will reveal the circumstances of his death, but I don't have to tell you that you're all now prime suspects in a murder inquiry." Venko left that statement hanging in the air for an uncomfortably long time, after which he finally broke the silence with, "So, you now have a choice to make." Ares' collective attention was now focused on the Rear Admiral. "You can accept this is happening and face the consequences," he paused. "Or you can disappear." Marcos was sifting through the information he had just been provided in somewhat of a daze when a question pushed up through the noise and fog and cleared his senses. "Admiral, you didn't transfer us from a UNSC ship bound for port to a prowler and ship us to the system's edge to put us through court-martial." He paused, considering adding the details the LT had exchanged upon stepping aboard, and thought better of it. "So why are we here?" Aiden leaned back in his chair for a moment and rubbed the stubble on his face against the grain, then leant forward again. "Fireteam Ares, you witnessed situations on Actium that are unusual, to say the least. Unusual, but not unexpected. We've seen your mission footage already. Members of the Covenant have been working with UNSC forces. This is unusual because the Covenant look at humanity like a plague that has to be exterminated. It is not unexpected for a few reasons." The image of Rear Admiral Venko shrank to a corner of the display while analysis reports, field observations, mission camera footage and post-action reports winked onto the screen. Lieutenant Wiles spoke. "Our intel indicates that there is some degree of conflict between a couple of the member species of the Covenant. We also have implied intel from intercepted Covenant transmissions suggesting of a splinter faction from the Covenant, although at this time we have very little else other than implication. On top of this, the war between humanity and the Covenant has been raging for 20 years, and in that time we've lost countless colonies. As a consequence, huge swathes of people have been displaced and made homeless during evacuations. It was inevitable that some of these people would enlist with the UNSC to secure themselves a paycheck, support their families, and God willing, bring the fight to the Covenant rather than the other way around. It is also inevitable, Venko continued, that some of these new enlisted personnel may have once had insurrectionist ideals that, for the time being, they had set aside to fight our common enemy. But as the war continues and colonies continue to fall, it's possible, even likely, that these old resentments and a mortal fear of being on the losing side is fueling efforts to conspire with the enemy. You think Fireteam Dolos are insurrectionists working with the Covenant? Jay replied in question. There's no thinking about it. Isn't that right, Miss Silverton? Venko asked. Marcos, Jay, and Hamish simultaneously looked around to Kyra, who returned their gaze and replied, I provided information gathering and background checks on Dolos a few months back. Only were looking into their involvement with leaking information to the Covenant in contravention to the Cole Protocol. There were concerns that copies of nav data and trackers were being used to leak the location of human colonies to aid in the Covenant's extermination of humanity. As it was, that wasn't exactly what they found. Where in the hell did you find time to do this? Hamish asked in disbelief. You guys might have a continuous flow of white noise between your ears, but some of us have more going on than that. Quite so, the LT chuckled. Marcos maintained eye contact with Kyra for a moment, but began talking to the Rear Admiral. This is all very thrilling, but with respect, I don't believe you answered my question. Marcos paused, now looking at Venko once more. Why are we here? You've been selected as a viable squad for acquisition, Venko cut through the BS. Assuming you don't want to spend the rest of your lives rotting in a cell or worse, you will be transferred to only Section 3, where you will assist in matters we have discussed here. You will be deployed to hunt rogue parties within the UNSC, intelligence gathering on the Covenant and the Splinter faction, and where necessary, preemptive and offensive action against enemies of the Office of Naval Intelligence. The time has come for you to make a choice, the LT spoke again. What about Roberts? Jay asked. What about him? Venko dismissively replied. There was a pause while the rhetoric Venko was driving at sank in. The Office of Naval Intelligence were quite adept at making problems disappear. Their reputation as a clandestine intelligence organisation of the UNSC, cloaked in shadows, performing missions that never happened, in places that never were, by people who never existed, was the stuff of legend across the rank and file. Well, Venko asked, what's it going to be, Ares? The members of Fireteam Ares looked to Marcos, their squad leader. We either spend the rest of our lives in prison while the Covenant continue to erode what is left of humanity, or we join Oni and keep fighting, Marcos replied. We don't have a choice. We never did. Marcos looked to his teammates. We're ODSTs. Then he looked to the LT. We're fighters. And finally to Venko. We're in. Without missing a beat, Venko gestured. Lieutenant Wiles, as you were. The screen winked off. We are initiating a new program, codenamed Gemini. You'll be given access necessary to facilitate your roles. You and your gear are due an upgrade. The LT slid datapads across the table to them. These are your transfer sheets, security clearance, suppression orders, and consent forms. Consent forms? Jay asked. The LT smiled knowingly to herself. Ah yes. How are you all with needles? Fireteam Ares sat before a huge glass window looking out into space. They had been here for the past few hours after being fully debriefed. The Pale Horse had docked with a facility concealed within the Oort cloud beyond the outer reaches of the Epsilon Eridni system. This place had come to be known as the Ether, and for good reason. This particular region of the Oort cloud had an unusually high density of ice crystals, left over from the collision of two or more massive comet-like objects. As a consequence, what little light could be seen coming from the system's star was scattered and obscured by this unusual cloud of ice crystals, backlighting the cloud so everywhere you looked appeared to emanate an eerie blue-white glow. The facility itself was a classified development lab for Oni and looked a little bit like two UNSC cruisers docked side by side, but it was just a passing resemblance. Where they were stood was nicknamed the Star Side, basically the half of the facility facing the local star system and its star, with the other side facing into interstellar space. This nickname was equally as ominous as its official name, the Oni facility out of darkness into light, and its location, the communications blackout, and its distance from any other human population made it ideal to perform high-level research and development without attracting undue attention.
Fireteam Ares pre-op is ready for you.
The facility's disembodied AI spoke over local communications. Ares stood, Marcos scooping his datapad up and leading the team. Oni had Fireteam Ares by the balls, and they all knew it. If they refused Oni's offer, they'd either be returned to the UNSC and face court-martial, or, as was generally accepted for the modus operandi of Oni, Ares would meet a series of unfortunate circumstances, ultimately culminating in them disappearing into a cell in deep space somewhere for the rest of eternity. While one circumstance wasn't, at least at face value, a terrible outcome, the alternative was unfortunately much more likely. So while it was packaged up and labelled in such a way as to appear as an offer for transfer, it was more a formality, because Oni wanted Ares for something and Oni get what they want. So they had signed the necessary paperwork, been approved specific security access, and were now officially an Oni-operated strike team. Marcos mulled over the datapads they were given. In between the redacted segments and black ink, a basic narrative of intentions of their acquisition was beginning to shine through. Some references to the success of the Spartan 2 program, but also its failures. Very vague references to another class of Spartans augmented in 36, with much better success rates, and a desire to work these augmentations into refinement so that more servicemen and women could receive them to bolster UNSC forces and secure humanity's future beyond this war. Ares climbed into a shuttle transport to be ferried across to the other side of the facility, which would take them briefly out of an airlock between the two cruiser-like halves of the station, and then continue through the shadow side for a further 500 meters. Unbeknownst to Ares, and in truth most of the rest of humanity, the Spartan 2s weren't the only Spartans out there now. The Spartan 3 program had improved on the earlier program and had managed to augment the candidates with 100% survival rates, as opposed to the approximately 50% survival rate of the previous class. The first batch of these newer Spartans had already seen battle in 2536, and had proven without a doubt the urgency of needing more warriors on the front line with the speed, strength and lethality of the Spartans. The issue, however, was that both the Spartan 2s and 3s were conscripted as very young children. The 2s were conscripted as 6-year-olds with very strict and specific genetic markers, while the 3s were orphans of the war with the Covenant. Both classes were augmented at 14 years old due to how easily younger bodies take to augmentations. The shuttle came to a stop and its doors slid open. Ares disembarked and took a few steps towards seemingly the only door on this level. The door slid silently open. They walked through it and into the almost unnaturally white observation room. Another door lay in front of them, with a wall of windows looking through to the pre-op room itself. A doctor at a desk to the left of the door stood. He was a young doctor called Marius, probably in his mid to late 20s. His long white hair pulled back into a man bun, a tidy goatee and handlebar moustache framed a face set with strong cheekbones and icy blue eyes. Marcos had quietly looked into his training and background. He came with a boatload of qualifications and honours, although there were reports about his worry about breaking rules, to the point that in the past he'd occasionally broken lesser rules in his attempts to avoid breaking the bigger ones. This would normally be cause for alarm, but this showed Marcos that he could at least prioritise and make sacrifices when needed. Although what they were doing was absolutely necessary, it didn't come without risks and the odd rule breaking. Admittedly, those involved had volunteered for the procedures, but there were still ethical complications surrounding the biological augmentation of humans, be it voluntary or otherwise. When Oni wanted something done, it got done, regardless, and there was no illusion about Oni being more than capable of hiding a few black ops. Oni were probably hiding all sorts of secrets. Not many people trusted them, but when it came down to it, when something extreme needed to be done, Oni were the people to do it, and keep it hidden, and in that respect Marcos trusted them completely. As long as he kept to his orders and didn't question them, he wouldn't piss anyone off, and he expected the same would be true for Marius.
"Hello,
Dr. Marius graciously nodded. Are you ready to begin? Ares nodded in response. Dr. Marius began. So there have been many advancements in augmentations. Given the new type of administration procedure the augmentations are, don't bore me with the details, Hamish cut him off. What exactly are you going to be doing to us? Quite simple, Marius began. First, we'll surgically break your legs and arms and a few other key areas. Space the breaks apart and keep them that way with tailored surgical titanium inserts that will osseointegrate into your skeleton to make you a little bit taller. Then your bones will be grafted with a reinforcing fullerene lattice that will make your bones tougher and harder to break. Finally, we'll stitch you all up and hit you with a dose of fibroid muscular protein complex to increase your muscle density and strength. Then we wake you up and see how your bodies handle it. Hamish's face went pale. That was decidedly more than I wanted to hear. You asked. Marcos shook his head. And these are the same augmentations the Spartans got? Jay asked. No. Marius nodded with a smile in contradiction to his words. So they're new augmentations? Marcos asked. Yes, Marius replied, then reconsidered. No. It's complicated. So when we wake up we'll be taller, stronger, and tougher. Hamish grew impatient. That you will, but you'll still be a way off of the Spartans. We're really only giving you a couple of the augments at this time. So there'll be another time, Marcos clarified. Oh, I couldn't possibly say, Marius smiled. The collective patience of Fireteam Ares was now dwindling.
Dr. Marius,
the synthetic voice of the facility's AI spoke.
Cognitive impression modelling facilities are being brought online. Flash cloning chambers are also being made available.
Marcos locked eyes with Marius, who looked confused back at him. Oh, thank you, Aaron, Marius dismissed. Cognitive, flash cloning, anything you want to tell us? Marcos pushed. Nope, that's something else, and you don't have clearance. Dr. Marius smiled and beckoned them. Please follow me. We'll get you prepped and sedated, and before you'll know it, you'll be in recovery. Ares followed Dr. Marius into the pre-op room where they were greeted by several surgeons and anaesthetists and began getting prepped. While publicly the Spartans were undefeated and were almost single-handedly winning the war, the reality was much more grim. The Spartans were incredible warriors, there was no question, but there just weren't enough of them, and the Covenant had just kept coming and had continued to push humanity back, glassing world after world. Due to the limitations of the earlier augmentations and only being able to use children for the sakes of the augmentations, the UNSC were losing ground quickly. The only way to remedy that was to make more Spartans, but since time wasn't on their side, and acquiring children for the programs was prohibitively difficult, time-consuming, risky, and illegal, the groundwork had to be laid to refine the augmentations so that eventually fully grown adults could receive them. That's where Ares came in. They were effectively extremely early test subjects to find out if some of these retooled augmentations could be given to fully grown consenting adults, without insurmountable consequences, of course. Lab rats was the term Hamish used. Nevertheless, the simulations all pointed towards the success at this early stage, and Oni would make good use of Fireteam Ares thereafter. Ares had finally stripped and donned unflattering hospital gowns, climbed onto their beds, and were being fitted with biomonitors and IV drips. Okay, I think we're all set, Dr. Marius said. Any questions before we get started? Yeah, who do we report to here? Who do we talk to when this is done? Jay asked. Your handler, Marius replied. Handler? Kyra questioned. Your commanding officer, Marius clarified. Ares still looked vacantly at him. He huffed in irritation and consulted his datapad, pulling at his goatee in frustration. Lieutenant Wiles. A ripple of acknowledgement played across their faces. You guys are new to this, aren't you? Marcos chuckled and laid back, making himself comfortable. Yeah, you could say that, Doc. Marius half smiled and walked over to check Marcos's biomonitoring feed. Well, it's my experience that Oni will only tell you the absolute minimum. If they don't tell you, there's a reason for it. If you feel like you should know something but don't go looking for the answer. You'll just get yourself in trouble. That include figuring out who our CO is? Marcos sarcastically asked. I think that's more so a personal thing to her than a procedural thing for Oni, Marius replied. An alert popped up onto the screen. Anesthetic administration starting now, Dr. Marius reported. The IV drips connected to each team member began to pump a powerful anaesthetic into their blood. "Give me a countdown from 10, Staff Sergeant Black," Marius asked with evident glee in his voice. Marcos raised a mildly irritated eyebrow at him, sighed, and began. 10, 9. Marcos felt a wave of vertigo overcome him, and his eyes suddenly felt very light-sensitive. 8. He closed them and listened to the sounds of the room and felt his thoughts clouding. 8, 7. The subtle hum of the machines in the room and the background of the facility merged into a single noise level and began to fade and dissolve to nothing. 6. Marius smiled to the other surgeons monitoring the other members of Ares, with them indicating the other 3 members were sedated. "Okay, let's move them." 5. Marius looked down at Marcos with an impressed smile. There was a pause where he barely held back a childish giggle. "Any more?" Marcos bit his lower lip, attempting to mouth the number 4, but it resulted in a stifled exhale. "We'll call that 4.5. It's got to be a new record." The doctors moved through and uncoupled the beds from the seating and readied them to be moved from pre-op into the operating theatre.